Good afternoon, Professor George Day, Provost and Deputy President of SMU, Professor Rajendra Srivastava, esteemed guests, and ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the Singapore Management University and the Shaw Foundation Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series. We are delighted to have Professor George Day, Professor Jagdish Sheth, Mr. Neil Cross, Mr. Ambrish Jain, and Mr. Sumit Basin here today to speak on the topic of innovation driving growth. Professor Day is the Geoffrey T. Boisi Professor and co-director of the Mack Institute of Innovation Management at the University of Pennsylvania and Wharton School. He will present today's lecture on Innovate to Grow, Leadership Strategies for Accelerating Growth. The lecture will be followed by a discussion among our distinguished panelists. Before we begin, I would like to invite the SMU Provost to say a few words.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, students, good afternoon and welcome to SMU for the Shaw Foundation Faculty Lecture Series. This lecture series was established in 2001, so we've been going on 13 years, and it was established to promote a deeper understanding of issues that were permeating the fast-changing global environment. For the last 3 years, SMU has dedicated the Shaw Foundation Lecture Series to the management of innovation. So we've decided to focus on the management of innovation. And the question is, why are we focusing on innovation? First, it is the driver of well-being, if you will, in this part of the world. It offers a way for Asian companies, emerging market companies, to climb up the value ladder. Singapore has been very, very innovative in its own ways, and today we enjoy one of the highest per capita income, per capita GDP in the world. But what is not known as well is that in terms of numbers of hours that Singaporeans work, it's approximately 20% higher than the OECD average. So the issue really is that we ought to be looking at ways in which we can work smarter, not necessarily just work harder, and innovation certainly is very much a part of that. Also, within Singapore, we've gone up the economic ladder, if you will, by considerable investment, if you will, in new technology. And our focus has been on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And of course, Singapore has added another M to it, which is medicine. And so we've focused, quite a bit on that. And however, in addition to generating the technology, we also need to find out ways in which we can get it into the marketplace to extract the value of that upstream commitment and investment. Just to kind of reinforce that point, I want to remind the audience that Henry Ford did not invent the automobile or the internal combustion engine. He developed the assembly line. He developed a process by which that particular invention, the automobile, could reach a much larger marketplace. So what are we trying to do at SMU? At SMU, we are focusing on innovation as one of our key areas of excellence. And when we say an area of excellence, what we imply is that we have to have some thought leadership in it. We have to have the intellectual property, if you will. We also need to have some of the leading educational programs in that area of excellence. And the third element is that we ought to be influencing practice in that area as well, working closely with the business community and getting things implemented. So in terms of the education side, the kinds of things that we've done from the very day we started, we've focused on entrepreneurship, technopreneurship. Last year, we launched a the first program in Asia in Masters of Innovation Management. And we are now partnering with other educational institutions, with the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur, which is my alma mater. We're also working with SUTD in a collaborative way. So we want to look at innovation in partnership with other institutions. Now, what SMU provides is thinking and research in terms of how do we take things to market. We don't have engineering, we don't have medicine, we don't have physics, but what we do have is the capability to take the innovations and find out ways in which we can take them to market, look at the business models that might be necessary in that process. On the side of practice, we've had this Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and in that we have an incubator, we have an accelerator, and we have also launched an Asia Private Equity Institute. So the idea really is how do we extract value out of companies that may have been started through the incubator. More recently, we have formed an iClub. It's an innovation club targeted at folks in the business community who have responsibility for innovation in the organization. And there are several of the people who are present here in this audience today from that group, including people on the panel. So we're interested in developing a community of use, a community of innovation within the island. The two previous lectures on innovation challenges were delivered by colleagues, one at London Business School and one at Cambridge. So this year we have decided to go a little bit further west. And so our special guest today, as was announced, is Professor George Day from the Wharton School. For those of you who are less familiar with SMU, SMU started in collaboration with the Wharton School, and so we're really, really grateful for George Day to be here. And I know that George doesn't like to be embarrassed, so I'm not going to repeat the title and so on, but he's been one of the most influential people globally when it comes to marketing strategy. He was the executive director of an organization called the Marketing Science Institute, probably one of the most creative institutes that brings together folks from industry and some of the leading academics. If you want to think of MSI as a broker of thought leadership, and George managed that process. He has also served as the chairman of the American Marketing Association, and that is the largest organization in our field. He's a prolific author. He's written about 18 to 20 books, and the last book is guiding the conversation today. He is very, very passionate about market-driven strategies, meaning using information from the market to decide what we ought to be doing. But he's also very, very passionate about developing the right capabilities to do those things. So if I oversimplify things, he's really a thought leader in doing the right things, but also doing them right. And he's been a consultant to numerous companies. I believe he's worked with General Electric now for over 3 decades. He outlived Jack Welch at GE. And so his topic, also I do want to mention, he is one of my mentors, and I owe my PhD idea to him as well. So I'm really, really grateful that he's here today. The title of his talk is Innovate to Grow and Leadership Strategies for Accelerating Growth. Please welcome Professor Geoffrey.
Raj, thank you for that most generous introduction. Welcome to all of you. I'm looking forward to sharing my thinking with you and the reactions to the panel. But I look out and I see a number of friends, and I see an institution that has prospered mightily since the year 2000, and I was actually here at the inauguration. So it's been truly a privilege to be part of the journey, the innovative journey that has led to the school in its present, I think, very healthy and influential condition. And it's been a story that's been entwined with the success of Singapore as well. So, for many reasons, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to share with you the latest research and thinking that we've done around the concept of innovation prowess. You've all heard of Murphy's Law, haven't you? Well, actually, there is a corollary. O'Reilly has a corollary to Murphy's Law, which is that Murphy was an optimist. Here we go. My title is actually Innovate to Grow, and I'm going to develop one part of this theme around innovation prowess. Now, I find it interesting always to put a question mark behind the title. And so the question, Innovate to Grow, if you put a question mark that, well, what do we mean by innovation? And what kind of growth? The innovation I'm going to look at is something different that has impact, as a good pocket definition. The grow part, I'm going to focus on organic growth. That is growth that you sustain in your own organization through your own resources, as opposed to mergers and acquisitions, JVs, although they play a crucial role. So the question I'm going to focus on is what distinguishes the leaders within an industry from the laggards. And the kinds of companies that I have been studying are over there on the right-hand side. You will recognize all of them, I'm sure, possibly except for Celgene, which is a huge leader in the biosciences. But the answer I've come up with, which I'm going to share with you today, is this concept of innovation prowess. And the idea behind innovation prowess can be, I think, thought of in the same way as athletic prowess. You can be a talented natural athlete, but you won't achieve your potential unless you bring discipline and training, hard work, and focus on best practices. So you need to have both ability and you need to have discipline. I'm going to look at the discipline part of this equation, and you'll see that the basic structure of my talk is going to be around this top line, strategic growth-seeking discipline. And I'm going to be looking at companies like Procter & Gamble, Samsung, which are highly disciplined in their focus on identifying growth opportunities and then selecting the best ones to pursue. The discipline then is married with innovation ability. So the combination of discipline and ability is the result of the development and launching of the best opportunities. So you take the two together and you've got innovation prowess. So the reason that I'm going to focus on the organic growth part of it and the role of innovation in it is because organic growth is at the top of the CEO's agenda in 4 out of 5 companies. And the core reason for that is there's only 2 ways to grow your stock price. Increase your operating profit and raise the expectations of growth in those operating profits. And it's the key word there is expectations. You've got to get people to believe that your organization is indeed capable of and is investing in and has a track record that will allow it to grow on a sustainable basis through its own resources. So as a result, we see that innovation is also at the one of the top 3 priorities in most organizations. In fact, it's the top priority in 26%. And there is a strong connection also to the mergers and acquisitions side of things, because it turns out that companies that have innovation prowess are also very good at taking their acquisitions, and of course, to realize the value in your acquisition, you have to get it to grow as well. So the CEO is looking at this, making it a high priority, and driving the organization forward. Yet, and this is where I'm going to spend a fair bit of time, the reality is that in most large cap organizations, most managers are not certain they can reach their organic growth goals. Our latest research is even more disturbing, and that is we have discovered that only 18% of managers actually believe that they're going to get a decent return on their investment in innovation, that it will exceed the cost of their capital. So I'm going to look in behind that and share with you what we've learned about why there is this uncertainty and then what we can do about it. And I'm going to break it down into the growth inhibitors for strategic discipline, and then we'll look at the growth inhibitors around the ability to innovate. And these are in kind of a related order, but I'm going to start with the narrowness of the definition of innovation as one of the big inhibitors. And the idea here is that pretty much captured by the quotation from a VP of Innovation, not Procter & Gamble as it turns out, but they did a study and they discovered to their surprise that while they spend most of their time, energy, and money on 80% of it on product innovation, yet only 10% of the benefits come from this area. So what I'm going to look at here is the area particularly of business model innovation, and we'll look at the other pathways for growth. So this raises the question, well, what do we really mean by innovation? I feel that there are a number, in fact, there's some 50 definitions of innovation around, but the one that I'm going to focus on really has its origin in Thomas Edison, who really, I think, was the preeminent innovator. Didn't invent much, but he innovated. And so he said, well, I find out what the world needs, then I proceed to invent. And the value of an idea lies in the using of it. So it's not the technology. You'll notice that in none of these definitions is there the word technology, although technology is a huge enabler to almost everything we do, nor is creativity an essential ingredient, although it's implied in here. What we're going to look at is the result. So I like Scott Anthony's definition, but for practical purposes, there was an advisory committee that came up with a definition which I think captures the essence of what we want to get at, and that is the design, development of new products, services, or business models. And this is the area where much of the action is taking place right now. And I think Raj and I have talked a lot about how SMU can really focus on the area of business models and leverage that, because that's where we're finding not only is there great opportunity, but high returns. And the role of these innovations is to create new value for customers and financial returns for the firm. The second inhibitor, which many of you will recognize, is this, and if you like, the reason why so many managers are uncertain about their ability to reach their organic growth targets is that they don't support the growth objectives with enough resources or time. And so we can capture that idea around the core question, how on earth are we going to close the growth gap? And so the essence of innovation is to invest now to get the rewards later. And where I find the trouble often occurs is the shortage of investment with a long-term horizon on it. So what do we mean by the growth gap, and why does it take so long to invest in here? The growth gap is the difference between the momentum of the strategy, and by momentum here, as we can see, there's all sorts of, I mean, you may be able to reach substantial organic growth just out of the growth of the market, out of productivity gains, of price increases, but don't bet on it. So the essence of this model is that we need to understand what our baseline is and how far we're going to be able to grow the business just with its own momentum, the continuation, if you like, of the strategy, product range, as well as the growth initiatives that are already underway. But normally, we get closer to the worst case. That is, the growth is actually slower than we would like, and it may actually be turning down. If the growth in the market, consider what happens in a maturing market. We'll see certainly slow growth in units and a lot more price pressure. And that's the dilemma facing a lot of companies. Meanwhile, they've got a growth objective on the top line there, which is ambitious, represents our aspirations, and it's often the case that these growth objectives come from senior management turning to the business unit managers and say, look, in order for me to make my numbers, you have to make your numbers. And so it's very much a top-down generation of the target. But that is the growth objective that companies often can't realize. And in order to realize it, of course, you've got to put the dollars in now in order to get the payout in 2 to 3 years, because the more significant the innovation, the longer the lead time on development and launch. Third reason is that short-term pressures absorb all the resources. So in order to have significant impact with an innovation, whether it be a business model, a new product, a new service, we have to invest significant resources. And yet, short-term pressures, by that I mean demands of the sales force for responses to competitive moves. Big customers come along and say, look, I need a variant for my particular needs. If you're selling to the retail trade, they will often say, look, I need a special range just for me. But here's the challenge. If the small I initiatives take all the resources, the big I bets are seen as too risky and distant. So let me say a little bit more about this distinction between small I and big I so we can frame the dilemma of innovation. Is most organizations devote their time and energy to small I innovations, but they don't move the profit dial. So here's a way of thinking of it along what I call the innovation spectrum. At the left-hand end, you've got the small I. Think of as line extensions, upgrades, what we do to stay in the game. That is the essential product improvements, package changes, all the things that we need to do to stay ahead of competitors with our existing range and meet the demands of competitors and the sales force. And it's sometimes called the red ocean because this is the established, highly competitive market, and the red comes from the blood of the sharks that are circling around to chew up their other rivals and gain a little bit of an edge in market share. Well, it turns out small I is low risk, small rewards. You have to do it, but it's not going to significantly close that growth gap we talked about. On the other hand, big I, which is dramatic disruptive innovation, sometimes called blue ocean to denote the idea that there's not a lot of direct competition. is generally pretty high risk. You have to accept a lot of risk in order to get the big rewards. Now, we can actually calibrate that, and one of the areas of research that we've spent a lot of time on is to understand the probability of failure of the different categories of innovation. So the way to read this is that the data comes from about 350 commercialized innovations that were categorized into this matrix. Those of us that have been in the field for a long time will know this was a matrix that was originally innovated by Igor Ansoff. But we populated it over, it's taken me, I'll bet 15 years to populate this with data because the companies are not thrilled with divulging their failures. But the result of it is that we can categorize innovations that have been launched into the market. Think of a big initiative according to whether they're adjacent to the existing business, that is, they are drawing on the existing resources, knowledge of the market, access to the channels, or completely new to the company. Going vertically, same idea. We have product and technology. If it's based upon our existing products or adjacent or new to the company. And you can see in here that even in this zone here, which we'll call small I, that's still pretty risky. Now, what do I mean by probability of failure? This is, or we might call that probability of disappointment, because some of these will stay in the portfolio, but the risk is defined by falling short of the profit and revenue expectations by at least 45%. In other words, if you got funding for a new project, a new growth initiative, and it was based upon certain projections of revenue, profitability, cost, and so forth, and if the revenue over the next 3 years, whatever the planning horizon is, fell 45% or more below that, it would be considered to be a failure. And the argument is that if you had come in with those numbers in the first place in your capital appropriation request, you would have not gotten the funding to launch the product anyway. But as we go up towards the top right corner, you're looking at probability of 75 to 95% disappointment, falling well short. Just to give you an idea of some of the how we would calibrate things, I would put, for example, the original Tata Nano pretty much in the middle, maybe a little bit up towards the top right corner. And as we know, that was a significant disappointment. We had a wonderful visit and recognition of Ratan Tata on Monday. And I think he would recognize that the Nano was a disruptive innovation, really did change the game, but it was badly positioned. It was positioned in the market as a cheap car, and it turns out people don't like cheap. Even though they may have a tuk-tuk or a motorcycle, their next car is not going to be a cheap car. And so they have to unwind that and relaunch it, as they will, I'm sure, in Africa and the Middle East. But that just tells us that there is a lot of risk to be taken. My conclusion out of this, by the way, is that a disciplined approach to innovation is going to focus on the expansion into adjacencies rather than the top right corner. That this is really the sweet spot for innovations that are significant, and we'll hear from the panel more about what their thinking is on this, but that they're rooted in some knowledge of the market, because the reason that it's so risky going from, particularly, you'll see the risk mounts up very fast as we go from left to right, And the reason is that we don't, as we go to the far to the right, we don't know the market, we don't know the competitors, we can't reach the channels, and so the market forces are significantly riskier. The fourth big inhibitor is outside-in thinking, or rather inside-out thinking that narrows the search for opportunities. And by inside-out, I mean the kind of thought process that leads one to start with the resources you've got now and say, the question over on the right-hand side is, well, how can we sell more? How can we improve productivity? Inside-out thinking is say, okay, we have some technology here. How can we sell more? How can we find new applications for it? And that's, by the way, an extremely important question. But it does narrow one's approach to innovation opportunities. I much prefer to start from the outside in and ask the question, well, how are the needs of our customers changing? How can we help them succeed? This is the question I think that has to be first and foremost in the pharmaceutical industry. They are at an interesting juncture now with the declining productivity in their R&D pipelines, and they're looking at other ways to add value, bring value to their customers, which would be the payers, the patients, and the providers. And so they're looking for ways to help those patient providers and contribute to actually succeed. We also have to be mindful of what the competitors are doing. An important question is, what are the barriers to consumption? And by that I mean, think about the big game market. The Wii, the Nintendo Wii, succeeded by overcoming the barriers to consumption. If you think about an Xbox or a PlayStation, that requires a lot of skill. It's expensive, time-consuming, and the brilliance of the Wii was that it overcame those barriers to consumption. And here's a company that I think is masterful at outside-in approaches to innovation. So if we think about Amazon, they started, of course, as we all know, as an online bookstore, but they ended up succeeding with and becoming dominant in the ebook market because of this approach of outside-in thinking. He said, rather than ask what we're good at and what else we can do with that skill, we ask, well, who are our customers? Let's stand in their shoes, live their lives, understand what they're experiencing, what their pain points are, how they view risk. And then you say, we're going to give it to them regardless of whether we have the skills to do so or not. So the second category of growth inhibitors is this inability to execute. And so we've talked about the strategic issues. Now let's look at very quickly some of the reasons that we have studied in innumerable case studies as to why companies are unable to execute on their innovation initiatives. So they may have a great idea, but what happens? Well, culture is at the top of the list because culture is the way we do things around here. And if you're risk averse and what I call technology-centric, you're largely going to be focused on inside-out thinking. Leadership commitment is a huge factor, and that sets the tone at the top. If the leadership is not passionate about innovation and passionate about growth, the organization gets the signals. Incentives get in the way. So if the organization is incented on short-term earnings, quarterly results, again, there's going to be a reluctance to take the risk that you need to overcome all those barriers I talked about. one of the indicators I use of an inability to execute is that instead of really doing a systemic analysis of your culture, your capabilities, and your organization, you get into what I call point solutions. So you run an innovation tournament, and you have prizes for the best idea. The idea of an innovation jam is you bring together, and by the way, these are all good ideas, but they're point solutions. They have short-term impact, everybody gets excited, but the system is not ready for them. Or you start a corporate venture group. So putting these ideas together, I'm going to jump to this slide, which really kind of pulls together this notion that innovation prowess requires both strategic growth-seeking discipline and an ability to execute based upon an innovative culture, one that can accept risk, learn from its disappointments, adaptive capabilities, and a configuration I use to embrace both the organization structure, the incentives, metrics that the organization uses. So in looking at these corners, let me just kind of start to wrap up now so we can turn to the panel. But I'll give you a couple of examples so you can get this idea cemented a little better. I want to talk about the story of Lego as an example of a company that lacked innovation prowess and rebuilt it, and let's see what the results were. So everybody knows Lego. How many in this room have a set at home? Oh my heavens. That looks like about half. Well, here's your piece of trivia for the day. If you took all of the Lego blocks that were ever built and divided by the population of the Earth, there would be 86 blocks per person. I mean, get your mind around that. So it's embedded in our psyche. It's enormously popular, and yet, if you look at this, this is the sales in Danish kroner. In 2004, they almost went broke. Came very close. And what happened? They didn't change their ability to execute at all. What they lost was what I would call strategic focus. They tried everything. And so they said, well, we're going to become a lifestyle company, and we'll get into recordings. We'll build a theme park. In fact, they built several theme parks. We'll make movies, and we'll get into action figures. And they thought, well, the Lego brand will give us license to do all sorts of things. Complete lack of discipline. Everybody did their own thing. And I'm sure it was a lot of fun for the designers and developers, but the organization utterly lost focus. In 2005, they tightened things down, stripped out all of these excursions. They sold the theme parks, they cut back, and they said, we're going to focus on the play experience. And their forte, of course, is that parents and kids both benefit from the construction of the Lego sets. And then, in fact, that's going to be their main theme as they enter, particularly make a big push into China, is that they are going to focus on the parents because the parents think that this is really good for their kids. So this is a company that exercised strategic discipline and got back to now the leading company in the toy industry. So in light of time, let me just kind of sum up here and remind you then again, this notion of growth-seeking discipline is about a wide-ranging search for opportunities coupled with innovation ability, and that's the growth realizing process that drives the specific development, launch, and learn of each project. But you've got to have a strategic view. And the last thing I want to share with you is, well, what do we mean by a search for opportunities? Because what we've learned about companies that have really solid strategic discipline in growth-seeking discipline is that they cover a wide number of pathways. So by taking the idea of the business model, they now have stretched and reimagined their strategies. So the idea of full spectrum innovation, which is part of this search for opportunities, says, let's take our strategy definition, which is the value proposition in the business model, and let's reimagine every element of it. The target customers, what we offer, and how we differentiate ourselves from competitors. That's the value profile. Similarly, we can reimagine our value creating system and our value capturing system. And this is, I think, going to be a central part of the research initiatives at SMU. I think they've got some really distinct strengths in this area. Just to show you some of the possibilities out of here, let's look at some of these pathways very quickly. And I won't go through each one, but we can take customers, offerings, value profile, and pathway one. Let's go out and really understand latent or unmet needs. Pathway two. I've talked about the we. Classic example of identifying barriers to consumption. So you may be perfectly happy selling to 20% of the market. What about the other 80%? How can we get them in? We're going to hear from a colleague at Procter & Gamble about new market segments, and particularly globalization is a big opportunity. We can improve the customer experience. And of course, always, you can innovate new products and services. That's at the core. A lot of energy going around customer-focused solutions that are bundles of products, services, information, and particularly focused on helping the customer reduce risk. Innovative imitation is taking an initiative by a competitor, re-engineering it, back-engineering it, and then coming up with a modified and improved version. And then we can eliminate, increase, or reduce the value attributes. Now, I'm giving you a quick overview just to suggest there's a lot of pathways, even in stretching and reimagining our value proposition. Similarly, we can recast the business model and change the activities that and reimagine them. So we can build a sense and respond model, go to market more effectively. By shrink the core and leverage the network, you're innovating by asking the question, what are the core activities that we really need to have? So Bharti Airtel has pretty much sold off all of its engineering network and fiber optic network to concentrate just on innovating products and services and providing a superior experience. We can reimagine all of our core processes. And in the domain of value capturing, lots of different ways to shift from, and I think one of the big sea changes we're finding in many markets is a shift from pricing that charges for a product to having the customers only pay for what they use. This will transform many markets. So this idea is at the essence of what I'll call full spectrum innovation, which is the discipline comes in by investing heavily in each of these pathways to explore the opportunities and come up with better opportunities. And the final comment I want to make about this is that there's always a dominant pathway in whatever industry you're in. And you have to master that. You have to innovate on that dominant pathway, whether it's The drug industry, it's looking for new biologics or software, new software programs, packages. But the ROI of innovation on your dominant pathway starts to shrink as the industry matures. And that means that there are new opportunities that are more profitable that comes from following other pathways. And that's why, in a nutshell, business model innovation is going to be so significant as we go ahead into the future. But a lot of these breakthroughs will come from new combinations that are enabled by technology breakthroughs. So we have to master both the advances in technology as well as reimagine every part of our strategy, both the value proposition and the business model. So that's what we mean by discipline, being very systematic about searching for new opportunities. So with that, we have, I think, enough material for the panel to get their teeth into, and I would welcome them up here. Let me bring up the panel and ask them to come up.
Well, in the interest of time, I will keep the introductions for the panelists short, but if you turn to your program booklet, you'll be able to find the bios there. So joining the panel will be Professor Srivastava, our provost, and Professor Jagdish, Professor of Marketing from Emory University. On the left, or on your right, would be Mr. Neil Cross from Mastercard Labs.
I haven't seen this one before.
And we also have Mr. Sumit Basin from P&G, as well as Mr. Ambrish Jain from Lenovo. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us for today's discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please use the microphones along the aisles to pose your questions. Kindly identify yourself and the organization you represent before asking a question. Thank you.
Let me quickly summarize 2 or 3 points. One is this whole issue of the discipline. Is the organization, does it have the discipline for the pursuit of growth and the role of innovation in that? And then the second question is the ability. You may have the desire, the discipline, but do we have the ability to, how can we build the capability? And of course, all this has to operate within different kind of competitive environments because your competitors are not possibly sitting still. And so we have a very interesting group. And what I thought I would do is get 1 or 2 questions from, ask the panelists 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I'll start with Ambrish Jain. Ambrish is at Lenovo and had previously been at Samsung. He is in charge of global marketing strategies. And in your previous life, as at Samsung, I'm sure you had to deal with this very, very aggressive and smart competitor called Apple. And you saw what Apple did with building the store network in the US and in Europe. And then I saw, as an outsider, I saw Samsung really accelerate in Asia Pacific. So tell us what you did, why you did it, and also perhaps compare the ability, compare the discipline that's within Apple relative to Samsung, since we're talking about discipline as one of the elements.
So let me share my experience at Samsung and a couple of questions. I think the one area is around speed and agility, which is also in today's world a critical component in terms of innovation and links to the narrow definition of how you define, Professor, you mentioned about the narrow view of innovation. So let me start by first asking, do you know Samsung had its own operating system? Does anyone in the audience know its name? Yeah, Bada. It was its own operating system back in 2005, 2006, 2007. And Nokia also had its own operating system called Symbian. If you look 5 years fast forward or 7 years fast forward, look at where Nokia is and where Samsung is. It's a story about one company making the change and realizing that their own operating system is not going to cut the core customer experience, which is on the internet and a browsing experience, and jumping on to something which was more innovative, which is Android, and another company which is stuck on with its own operating system. So there's a big element around the speed and the leadership commitment to make a change, realize what's not working and make that change. And that was what I believe in terms of what was the success behind Samsung, where as a leadership level, the company realized that, Bada is not going to work, put in the resources. There was another element which you said. So Samsung put in more than 2,000, 5,000 engineers. I don't know the exact number, but if you go to the Korea, the head office, and I have a colleague from Samsung as well, it's like a city in itself. And a lot of those are engineers from India, from all over the world, to create a skin, because Android was available for free for everyone, but Samsung created its own kind of unique customer interface which differentiated from others. And HTC was the first company which got on and got to a big scale on Android, but it was the speed and the resources which Samsung put, which really accelerated its growth to becoming the number one in mobile market, which it has. To your second question in terms of the whole stores, I would say it is recognizing something which is working or what's the core and adapting it, understanding yourself and adapting it to your own needs. Part of the reason why Apple kind of had its own store was, if you look at from a smartphone, a big part of the purchasing experience or a trigger is the experience of the shopper of playing with the live device at the store. Now that was why Apple invested significantly in creating these flagship stores, which was also a bit from an iconic status. Samsung, as we were kind of growing, and this is when I'm saying we, this is Samsung. So when Samsung was kind of in that growth mode, it did realize that it needs its own kind of this retail space to showcase the product and the range of products. And instead of going big like Apple did with its iconic flagship stores, each of which cost anywhere between $60 to $100 million to build up, it went on a much smaller and a more broader in-depth model where, for example, in the Southeast Asia alone, we would have opened up more than 500 stores in our region in the 18 months, which is more than opening a store a day. And that created the scale and the depth to win in the market.
And what kind of business model did you use to open the stores?
So again, a different business model. So Apple stores are owned by Apple with Apple employees. Samsung uses a more franchise model with so we work with our partners, distributors, and we used to subsidize a certain cost, drive a certain look, tone, feel, so that it looks like Samsung, but it enables a much faster execution at a lower cost.
Okay, so that's one of the elements of, from the competitive end, if you need speed, you got to go with a model that will deliver the speed.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let me turn this side now. Jagdish, you've been writing a lot on globalization for the last 25 years before the rest of the world kind of woke up on it. And so as you look at innovation, as you look at this issue of building discipline, when you take a global organization operating across many borders, operating in different cultures, what kind of challenges do you anticipate, and what maybe one or two ways of overcoming them within this context?
I think the biggest challenge is that as you globalize, you organize around either a matrix management, often a cube management, and ultimately a spaghetti management. You don't know who is reporting whom, So you start with a very simple design, a product-centric global company. You begin to expand now into geography centers, country managers, etc., which often, therefore, dilutes the decision-making process. And in the process, the adaptability goes away. And I find most companies fail, not just in innovation, but as corporate entities, if they're unable and unwilling to change. And often the core competency that you have becomes your core trap. You get trapped into that one. And the larger the organization and greater the cultural diversity, etc., harder it becomes to steer the ship primarily. That seems to me the key issue. And more companies begin to go into a denial stage. The world is changing around them. I remember in the automobile industry in the 70s in the US, GM, Ford, and Chrysler were denying that Japanese can ever compete in the cars. By the way, Japanese have gone through the same denial about Chinese car makers now, or the Indian car makers. It's interesting, you know, very fascinating. So I think denial is one of the biggest weaknesses in most companies, which is why George's comment about adaptability is very key, primarily. So the last point I wanted to make is that the world is moving much faster. For example, if you take only the last 10 years, start of this new millennium, we never heard of companies like, surprisingly, Google, which looks ancient now, let alone Facebook and all the social media, or Tencent that you mentioned. Can't believe the market cap of $1 trillion that Amrish mentioned, interestingly. But that's fascinating. So now you see companies like Alibaba, Tencent, becoming global challengers. Every industry you analyze, competition is coming from non-traditional competitors, non-traditional geographies, and companies just don't know how to adapt to that. So adaptation is one of the key disciplines. Are you able to adapt, and is the leadership capable of scrambling or challenging its own prevailing dogma of some sort? That to me is the key competency.
So what you're saying is the larger you are, the harder you fall.
Yes.
and unless you have the discipline and the intention, the flexibility,
Yes.
you are toast.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to constantly challenge yourself. So you go to Kodak as a company, or you go to, in fact, any of the, let's say, Lucent Technologies or Alcatel, they're also sure about analog technologies. Mm-hmm. And they look down on digital technologies. Today, digital cameras are capable of doing everything, and you just trap yourself in. I've seen this kind of a competency trap as the biggest disadvantage of companies, which I think what George was talking about, that how do you see new frontiers so you just do not stay in the box that you have created, where you are very successful in the past, but you are not successful in the future.
Okay, so you have to figure out a way to break out of that inertia.
Absolutely. And that's
and
what
Neil is an expert at doing this.
Wow.
He threatens to teach, we'll take you up on this, Neil. Our students would love it. But Neil talks about how do you go from idea to market in 48 hours, meaning a weekend. And Neil was from MasterCard.
Yeah, I still am.
Still am.
I still am, yes. And moving to DBS shortly. It's innovation's actually quite a political thing, and I've learnt a huge amount from George over the last few days. But innovation tends to be a team which is adjunct to the business as normal. Tends to be. In the best organizations, it's a coherent part. But in innovation, you tend to be competing with business as normal. So the job of business as normal is to incrementally improve products and services. So you have a team, a very large team, whose job it is to take your core products and over the course of a number of years is to improve them to a degree that they can compete against their competitors. So you look at the MasterCard business. Essentially, MasterCard are obviously by far the best card provider. There is a camera running, so I have to say this. But essentially, I mean, what is their business? Their business is a piece of plastic and a number, and you pay, you represent a number. And how do you improve on that? I mean, we've improved on that in some ways. The ability to pull a card and tap. You don't have to swipe. In Singapore, we still swipe and sign. In many countries, like Australia, we just tap. And you can tap here as well. DBS, another advert, are wonderful bank. So how do you approve on an experience where you pull a piece of plastic out and you just tap and you leave the shop? You can't make that any better. So to your point, we're in what they call the innovator's dilemma. So we have a huge core business around payments, huge. At MasterCard, I think the turnover is roughly 8-9 billion US and profits about 3 or 4 billion, based around that transaction. So as an innovation team, we can't go and reinvent that business. Of course we can't. It's hugely profitable. But there is a team of highly focused people whose job it is to incrementally innovate. So as an innovation team, 3 years ago, we started to innovate around the edges. So we thought about, okay, so people tap. But people don't care about MasterCard. They care about they need to pay. So we looked at the value chain, and we thought, wait a minute, no, people aren't paying. They're doing, they're living. They're waking up in the morning and they're thinking, oh, I need to buy, I've chatted to my friend Julie, and she come back from holiday. She had a beautiful holiday in the Seychelles. I want to go to the Seychelles. So I'm going to research holidays. And then I'm going to go online, and then I'm going to find somewhere. Then I'm going to, and eventually they will pay. So how do we become more relevant before the transaction, during the transaction? How do we make it more safe? And then post the transaction as well. So a lot of the work of MasterCard Labs is to how do we expand our relevance in that entire value chain. And initially we try to execute through the business. So we try to execute through product and through marketing and through sales. And we found that actually that wasn't that effective. Sorry to the teams who run that. So what we did, we actually set up incubations inside the company, startups, if you will. And the job of the startups were to execute in parallel with a lot more swiftness than the regular business would do. So even though we weren't competing with the regular business, we were actually running adjunct to them. And so MasterCard Labs and the innovation team, we actually release products. We can go, as you said, we can invent something and have a first stage product in 48 hours. But we can actually go from invention to product in market in less than 6 months, which is really quick for a company of our size with our level of capacity. And so that's what we found in the innovation team. The most important thing is speed and speed of that execution.
Okay, thank you. I was actually going to ask you a question, but instead I'll ask Sumit that same question. Company like MasterCard, company like Procter & Gamble has to deal with partners. You may want to make some changes in the electronic payment system, but your partners, the retailers, the banks, etc., have to be brought along in that same direction. And so this is an issue that all large companies faces. You don't do anything all by yourself anymore. Vertical integration is gone, and having to work with partners in the innovation space gets to be very critical. So Sumit is from Procter & Gamble, and it's his responsibility to manage these kinds of relationships.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. I mean, before I talk about the relationships which with partners, I just wanted to step back a bit and put why collaborate, and why in the context of P&G, why there was a call for transformation and change the way we were thinking. And it's really largely to do with the growth gap which George was talking about earlier on. And in order to close the growth gap, it was imperative that we had to get into new categories, whether it was building some of our mega brands or entering into new territories to serve new consumers or new unmet needs. And you know, when this is probably why I think around 2005, AG Lafley, our CEO, then declared that we wanted about 50% of our innovation to be coming from what we call connect and develop partnership. You could call it, open innovation, etc. And what we did at that time, we focused most of our connect and develop partnerships at, following George's model, looking at selective adjacencies and big I programs. And the selective adjacencies were things which as we were getting into new categories and expanding, we looked at innovation partners in that space. And the big I work largely on academia. And how can we develop a partnership with academia and commercialize some of the programs which were happening in the labs there a lot quicker. So when I look at those two contexts and the partnerships, one of the biggest learnings sort of I've had in challenges with partnerships is one, how do you dimensionalize quality? And especially true for adjacencies. It's really critical that you actually specify very earlier on in the process what we mean by quality. Because once you get downstream the innovation, you realize you're actually talking about two different aspects of quality, and the product at the end doesn't quite meet the expectations of the consumer. So that's one of the areas where we've had a lot of challenges. And there are some cultural differences as you partner with companies across the world. And that's probably a topic in itself. The second area is managing IP. And this has been a challenge because largely, the IP space is changing rapidly. What companies like ourselves are looking for is we're really interested in application IP, not early content IP. And I think one of our learnings is we were not very clear in our early days in actually specifying what we meant by application IP. But those are the two learnings which I've had, which from a culture point of view, as you look at partnerships, it's really, really important to get it right.
Wonderful. So now you have it. You've got an equal balance of theory and practice. You've got 3 faculty members. You've got 3 people from industry. Industry is represented across multiple sectors. So we've gotten as balanced and as broad a panel for you. And we'd like to turn it over to the audience to see what questions you have. And I hope amongst the 6 of us, we can come up with the answers. Anybody? Yes, sir.
The proposition, sir. Prof, you mentioning about firstly innovation. You give a definition of innovation, but you didn't give a definition for discipline. And a learned Prof Say was saying that, he picked up the issues of self-denial. And we have from P&G, dimensional. So the question I put it is drive, or beyond drive, above and beyond drive. Secondly, with regard to the question of full spectrum, why not total life cycle, 360 dimension? I don't know why you choose that. And thirdly, with regard to another one, I think that when you talk about pathway, why not challenges rather than pathway? Because those are the things that I think that entrepreneurs are looking for challenges and a kind of something which should not be traditional. Innovation, inventions are different. So the question is that if you are the first drivers, the architects of the undertaking, it's a lot of different from technician, reporters, and those third-party impression and expression. Would you care to comment on that? Thanks a lot.
The idea of the pathways, which you picked up on, is really to challenge the organization in a very disciplined way to say, how can we rethink the business? And so you push out beyond the dominant pathway and ask yourself, well, can we do what Neil is doing? Improve the customer experience and in a dramatically different way. So the idea of challenge, which I think is embedded in your question, is also inherent in this idea of being really disciplined about where you look for growth opportunities and then selecting only the very best ones. Now, I didn't get the prior question, so would you mind repeating the first question?
The question of drive, the question
a
you
question
have
of
discipline.
which?
It's a discipline can be in different form, in multiple form. The question is discipline is the core, the heart of the matter. If you lack discipline, there's no basis of entrepreneurship. That's exactly it is.
Yeah.
But the question is discipline in what form, in what manner, in what degree, in what dimension. That is why Prof. Say was saying that, if you're self-denial, then finish. And without dimension, as what P&G put it, then you're out of focus.
Okay, my name is Azak. I work as Associate Vice President at Excellent Technologies. In our company, Excellent Technologies, we introduced the startup, the companies within companies idea. So the challenge we are facing is we introduced the concept, ask people to come over with ideas. We will empower them to take it on, do something, create something new for the company. But we stumble upon, should we really choose this particular idea and give them some funding to go forward? Or, is it a good decision? The directors are stepping back a little bit. There is a panel that has to decide which to be recommended. And that panel, I guess, they don't have enough facts to support their decision to recommend somebody's idea. So how do we overcome these kind of challenges? I think we will spend a lot of time in evaluating the ideas without really implementing some. How do we overcome this?
Sounds like Excel systems are highly innovative. So congratulations to you. It is a challenge. Yeah, you are taking risks, and the money involved isn't, won't kill your company. Usually, I'm sure if you're in the same space, it's like a few $1 million, which is a lot, and but it won't sink your business. And I'm sure your directors, listen to these ideas and they're like, oh, wait a minute, do we, a few $1 million is quite a few. That's a small marketing team we could have instead of this risky or perceived risk of a new product or service or innovation or campaign. And the way we manage it at MasterCard and in Labs is obviously we have a top-level support from the CEO and the innovation team. It sounds like you have a board, a kind of board committee that decide on them. But we're very clear, so we have a template. And the template gets created about 30, 40 pages, and that's the business case. We usually have we use something called business model canvas. We use techniques like lean startup, which articulate the value that we will hopefully extract from that innovation. And the decision needs to be made very quickly. And so it's very binary. So once you fill out this template, the board meet, and they go, it's a 1 or a 0, yes or no. Are we going to move forward or not? And that's the only way to do it. You can't procrastinate on these innovations. But if you have the portfolio of innovations, how many do you look to implement a year? What's your plan?
I believe around 10.
Okay. So we do a small amount. We do about 4 a year. And we're very binary. We have to be. So we fit the template, and the template has decision points in there, and it's literally go or no go for the first initial funding. And that funding usually lasts a year, and then the startup burn through those funds, and at the end of those funds we measure, we learn, and then we decide to refund. So it's kind of incremental funding and incremental risk, but you do have to be very binary, and you do have to have a template and standardize on your decisions.
Thank you. I will follow on after the event. Yeah.
It seems like in the corporate world, this kind of a democratic way of generating ideas paralyzes the company also, as you have experienced. There are only two ways that I have found. One is that there is a very strong leader who says, I bet on that horse, no matter what debates, and you bet on that horse and see what happens. And since he or she is the leader of the company or a founder of the company, they decide. Not a bad idea. The other one is really to take a venture capital approach. You don't know the future. No matter how much you forecast out, all the research you don't know whether that innovation will succeed or fail ultimately, because it has to be contextualized in the world. So you take a venture capital approach to say, out of all this, let's bet on 5, 6, 4 will fail, but 1 will succeed, and one that succeeds is such a huge runner, which is what pharma guys do quite often, blockbuster drug. It takes care of all of the failures on the other side. You have almost 2 extreme ways of managing the internal process. That's what I've observed,
You asked one question, you're getting 3 answers. One of the problems that I've seen when you get too many projects is that you spread the resources. Companies are very good. Once they've committed to starting a project, then the budget takes over and people start defending their team. And it gets very, very difficult to kill projects, which makes resources less available to those projects that 1 out of 5 that is running ahead, that is likely to succeed, is now starving for resources because the other 4 haven't been killed yet. So that's only when you're still at the project stage. The real fun starts when you have a company within a company and the core company, the existing company, starts resisting everything that this new company. So it's probably a very good idea to take these initial startups, if you will, and keep them outside the control of the core company.
Evening, my name's Aditya Berry from DuPont. I had a quick question about incentive structures. What incentives have you seen work best in driving the discipline and behavior and the return on innovation within your organizations?
Looks like yours, George.
Yeah, how many hours have you got? So the problem of incentives actually starts with the metrics and the kind of behavior that you're trying to change or motivate. And that's where, frankly, a lot of the difficulty begins, because managers have often a dashboard which is focused on outcomes. That is, number of products that have been launched in a year, or the success rate. And these are all good, but they don't tell you how to improve the process or how to improve on the inputs. So I think a lot more work has to be invested in understanding the best metrics for evaluating performance. Then the compensation has to be aligned both with individuals and with groups. So you have group incentives that motivate the whole team in order to push the project through, but that means that you've got to motivate people to actually improve on time to market, which is, I think, a really important process measure, and focus more on those, which are the things that the team can control.
Thank you.
Well, George just talked about time to market, and that's an important consideration in terms of developing the product, but in terms of developing the business, a metric that I've worked on with some companies is time to money, and which means not only getting the product to the market, but also getting the market to the product. And
yeah, I was just going to add, I think the caution, and this was earlier, is also having the right metric in terms of failure. If you follow the approach of, and that depends upon the organization, if you're following the leadership model, it's really more on speed and time, because the leadership has made the decision on what innovation we bet big on, and you kind of follow. But if it's more of a venture capital model where it is, you got pipeline of innovation, typically the biggest challenge of these companies is in terms of metrics, how do you reward even failing fast and failing quickly, and learning from that. And the organizations and the leadership need to develop a metric which supports that, because, again, the drain on the resources, if you don't kill fast, that you won't have the one big idea to put resources behind.
But that raises the other dimension of metrics and incentives, and that is to support the culture. So there are some cultures that are very supportive of disappointments. They treat them as learning opportunities, and that kind of metric flourishes there. But an organization which treats failures as something to be punished, of course, will never adopt that kind of metric, and they discourage the kind of risk-taking that, as you saw from that risk matrix, you have to expect some failures. It's the only way you learn. You want to minimize the loss in doing that, but then you have to try a lot and fail fast. But if you get it right, then you scale quickly.
And I think if you look at Google and if you really, talk to people who are inside Google, I think that's one company today which is really following that principle around the, betting bigs on a few and willing to fail on a few things and just moving forward.
The one observation I would add is that incentives work very well on the positive side in a startup company by and large, which is the examples we all study from the Silicon Valleys and all these great successes. But in a mature, well-established organization, you also need to put disincentives from continuing to behave the way you do, which does not work with incentives, I must tell you. Incentives are just so marginal that the momentum of remaining status quo really carries on. If you look at the performance appraisal, the incremental that you ask for or get is so limited relative to what you are already having. Kind of same thing, So my view is that disincentives are very important in a well-established, mature organization, which says that if you behave that way, there is actually a punishment of some sort. To me, disincentives have to be incorporated along with incentives in a large organization.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, hi, my name is Xu Wei. I'm from Inverse Private Limited, which is a distributor of LED lightings. I've got one question. My question is, in recent years, we've seen stellar performance by Korean companies, but whereas their Japanese counterparts are not doing so well, even though they actually had very innovative technologies in hand and also they were not short of resources. So I would like to hear from your opinion, what in fact went wrong with their Japanese counterparts. For example, like their companies have sometimes, certain similarities in terms of culture, which is very hierarchical. So I'd just like to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Well, we have somebody who's...
You're right. Guess who's going to get that one?
I know, everybody is looking at me, so. I think there are two things which come to my mind. One is speed, and second link to that is the definition of innovation. And the third point, which Professor George said around, imitation and kind of business model innovation. I'll give you an example to illustrate. If you look at the whole instant messaging service, the big talk of the town is the $19 billion acquisition of WhatsApp, right? The first company to invent that was really BlackBerry. Many of you would have used BBM. Aware of the BBM service? Yes? Right? It started sometime in 2003-04, if I'm not mistaken. What's the value of BlackBerry today? Any guesses? Probably $2 billion, $4 billion. With all the hardware and the factories and the people and with the service which was innovated. Another company, WhatsApp, took that and started in 2007 or 8, okay, and sold for $19 billion. 2011, a Chinese company, Tencent, started WeChat. Many WeChat users? Do you know the value of WeChat today? It's part of Tencent, but the value of WeChat alone, it's got 350 million users, but the bigger value is average spend or average revenue of a WeChat user is $7 versus one of WhatsApp, and the value of WeChat is $70 billion, 50 to 70, meaning it's not sold, but that's the value. So it's about innovating. So the core is the same, but WeChat brought this whole idea around social commerce. There's 175 million users with registered pay, either credit information or some sort of a payment information on the WeChat, which WhatsApp doesn't have, and BBM restricted itself to just BlackBerry, and by the time it opened, it was way too late. So I think therein lies the kind of answer in terms of, if I look at Japanese companies, they really innovated in terms of, if you look at the innovation, Six Sigma, quality, all of those, but then the whole speed of innovation, they were not fast enough to adapt, versus if you look at the Korean companies, and Samsung is a great example in terms of speed of innovation, and kind of throwing it in the market, seeing if it works, if not, moving fast and adapting. It's more like being amoeba, being ready to move fast. You see an opportunity, you go there, put in your resources. If it doesn't, fail fast, move forward. Samsung uses a leadership technology. It's very top-down. It goes fast with it. Other companies uses their own. So you need to understand your core. And it's important, I think one of the points around Lego is understanding your core. I think part of the reason why they also kind of lost is they lost that core of Lego was all about building bricks, about the parent-kid interaction and building it up. But the moment they were able to innovate around their core, including the movie, which is all around the core, which has been a huge success, you've seen tremendous growth. But if they would have done that movie 7 years back, which was not around the core, they wouldn't have had the success. So those are kind of my answers.
It's hard to generalize because let's look at an industry where there has been a huge amount of innovation, and the Japanese companies are actually winning there. And let's go back to photography. And so we've seen Kodak go bankrupt in the last 2 years, but Fujifilm is prospering because, and both firms had equal ability. There was no difference in their ability to implement and execute and design superb products at high quality on a timely basis. They just couldn't focus themselves and make the big decisions to back out of film, which is what Fuji did, and go into other areas. So I consider Fuji a huge success story. I think what you're getting to is more the problem that Sony has run into. Again, a firm that has, in my terms, great ability if they are given good direction. But one could ask, well, what happened? Why did Apple come up with the iPod when you had the Walkman franchise? And I think therein lies the difficulty Sony has. Their inability to transcend silos. It's a highly hierarchical structure and slow-moving. Once they pull the trigger, they come up with great products, but they often are not able to move fast enough and strategically position themselves in the new markets. So mixed story, but I consider the Sony story to be really unfortunate.
One question and the third answer.
Yeah, exactly. There are two well-researched theories. The first one is in the 80s when Japan began to really dominate the world. One of the theories was about consensus management. Japanese culture is still anchored at the corporate level that everybody has to agree before they move. So lots of planning, getting internal buy-in before they execute. But once they are ready to execute, they move fast. But the time to make that decision go abroad is very slow. That does not seem to be the case for the Korean enterprises, whether it's a Hyundai or whether it's a Samsung, for example. They seem to be a little more saying that we will run with it, go with it, and that seems to make a difference between the two from a cultural and I would say corporate culture as opposed to a nation culture. The second one is that when you have a large domestic market, which is what Japan is, as it is in the US, everything else in the rest of the world looks peripheral. You look at it only from the domestic market perspective. Whereas Korea is a relatively small country, very much like Scandinavia, very much like Netherlands. They always think about the global perspective first. And that gives them an advantage of thinking of mapping everything on a global basis. And I've seen this very much among some Japanese companies, especially companies like NTT, which is a very large telephone enterprise, or their counterpart on the mobile side. They just have not thought of moving outside of Japan. China Mobile is doing it already. Airtel that George mentioned is an Indian company going into Africa. It's very fascinating how that domestic size and the market slows you down from a global perspective. That's why probably you are seeing. Those are the two theories that have been researched pretty well.
Thank you. Claire from IntelliHealth. So my question relates to the Productivity and Innovation Credit Scheme that Singapore has been essentially rolling out in the last few years. Could the several MNCs comment on how they have leveraged the PIC and whether it has had any impact, and if so, what?
Could you repeat the question?
Could you clarify that?
We're not
And
sure.
not use acronyms because foreign guests don't necessarily know the acronym.
I think the only acronym I used was MNCs, which stands for
MNCs.
multinational corporations. The Productivity and Innovation Credit, which some may know as the PIC, but I think I mentioned the full name just now. So it's an unfair question for Professor Day, but I would certainly love to hear his views as well. The question is really directed to the MNCs. This is a scheme that I don't know, the full value of the scheme, but it's obviously meant to increase innovation in the economy, and I'm curious to know how the companies have leveraged that and what impact it has had in each of your companies. Thank you.
Yeah, I can start with example from Lenovo. So we've got credits around, and I think the way the companies are using it is seeding some innovation around new areas. So for example, at Lenovo, that's been used to seed innovation around there's a social media hub and a social listening center, which has been created in Singapore for the globe. And it's looking at real-time analytics coming from the social listening and directing that into the product innovation, into marketing insights and marketing commercialization. So if you are asking, yes, so that's being used as a way to fund that innovation, which is, social listening. It's a relatively new thing. Some of the companies have been using it, but how do you use it? It's a new tool. There's tons, I was exposed to it. The amount of, I think I heard 6 terabytes of data in terms of the social listening which comes. How do you make sense of that reams and reams of data? So that's using the credits from the government. And I've seen at Samsung as well, we did the Learning and Innovation Center, which was done with partnership with EDB and the whole again. The intent is, and we did the product, at Samsung there's a Product Innovation Center in Singapore, and the intent there is how do you take some of the global products, but innovate based on local insights. So for example, in white goods category, refrigerators, washing machine, the cooking habits of an Asian consumer is different than that of a Western consumer. So how do you incorporate that in terms of some of the softer features which you design within a refrigerator while keeping the chassis the same? So some of that has been used by companies, and it's a great way to seed some of the companies.
I mean, just building on that, some of the areas where we've really leveraged it is in the area of life sciences. We've gone into some partnerships with A-Star where we've leveraged the lifestyle understanding and how that applies to some of our innovations. And then specifically for Asia is this, we have the need to understand how do our products perform in high humidity environments, and and we've used some of that seed funding, really looking at how do we improve products for this region.
My name is Pavan. I'm from SMU. My question was actually to Professor George today. I actually had 3 kind of dilemmas in trying to reconcile the slides that you showed about the technology adjacency and the customer adjacency and the risk rates of the projects. Could I just clarify something before I ask the dilemmas? Was the customer adjacency, was that framework or that map intended for consumer companies or B2B or both?
It applies to all. So the data, which is roughly now 350 commercialized ventures, including business model innovations and products and services, were actually probably a majority out of B2B. And in fact, there are two areas which don't stand up well in that risk matrix. One is pharmaceutical drugs, because they have such an enormously high failure rate, if you like. By the time they start from the molecule, they may only have one drug pass through stage 3. And the other one is, of course, FMCG, where the failure rates are actually much higher. They're approaching, even on small I innovations, close to 80 to 90% failure rates in my definition. So does that clarify it?
So therefore, three dilemmas that crop from that, given that it applies to both, you could choose to, in the time available.
So we didn't resolve any of those dilemmas?
No, I'm just going to raise them now. I was just waiting for your clarification. So you could choose in the time available, whichever of those three you'd like to address is up to you in the time available. One dilemma was, how do you define customer adjacency in a consumer context? Well, I mean, what does that mean? The second dilemma was, where does Google fit in on that? Is that an outlier? Because they seem to have, been at the extreme end of the right-hand side. And the third dilemma was, given the comments you made about balancing big I versus small I, how do you make that trade-off, given the huge risk rate of the big I? So if you could comment on any one of those three dilemmas or three.
Let me start with the second question, because I think that'll help you understand the other two challenges. They're not so much dilemmas, they're hard to do. So Google actually would use a matrix like this, and I teach in the Google Academy, and we use it. But Google starts off by looking at ventures like Google Glass or Google Mobility, and they use the matrix to evaluate the riskiness of each of those opportunities, given that they've got their search engine profitability. That's their core business. So you start with the core and then look at an adjacency and think of Google Glass as perhaps even beyond an adjacency. Gets us into a related, loosely related technology, but in an utterly different market. And you're absolutely right. The one that's most difficult to deal with is how much of an adjacency is a related market to us. And I'll just wrap up with an example from McDonald's. They launched McDonald's Pizza, and I think you'll all ask yourself, well, what happened to it? And the answer was that they thought it was not only, it was actually a fairly close-in adjacency. It used their existing outlets. They could easily fit it into their service model of delivery. But when it came to the customer's view, the brand promise didn't fit. McDonald's is literally a fast food, a grab and go. Pizza is a very different kind of experience. And although there were the same people coming to buy pizza, they were actually buying it for very different purposes. So the dimension of degree of newness on the market side is how well does our brand travel? Do we understand the customer? Do they understand us? Do we have any experience dealing with the competitors? And those are the factors. If you get into a completely big eye, completely new to the company, you're talking about new markets, new competitors, new customers, and the lack of knowledge is what really raises the risk level so high.
Panel, thank you very much for your insight into innovation and innovation discipline. I had a very complicated question about the role of M&A in enhancing the innovation discipline. But I won't do that though. I will ask you a short final question. So each of you, what do you do personally to basically train your innovation discipline? Just one or two words. Your own personal innovation discipline. How do you train this? Because you're all innovators, right?
was a 48 hours, right?
Listen.
You listen. Good.
No, I constantly look for new things to learn, and that's where it comes in. So I started as a behavioral understanding, micro consumer level psychology. Now I'm very macro and non-behavioral in perspective. So excitement of learning new keeps me constantly innovative.
Curiosity. Yeah.
When I want to learn something new, I volunteer to teach it.
That's actually my answer as well. And it's been fascinating as I reflect on my career. Much of my learning has been as a consequence of being forced into situations that I really didn't understand, and I had to go out and learn a lot very fast. So 18 years ago, good heavens, I was asked by the GE company to run their new venture innovation product planning portfolio of courses. And I had to learn very quickly what the capabilities were in the company, where the needs were, do a complete needs analysis, come up with a curriculum. And I can tell you, I don't know why they picked me, but I'm sure glad they did, because that pressed me to learn. Now, I had a background in new product development, but I was forced to learn. My experience curve was very steep indeed.
Read and reflect on how it could impact my business.
Two things. One, spending a lot of time with consumers, especially in the insight generation space, and then a disproportionate time spending with SME companies and really spending a lot of time outside with some of those small joint ventures.
Great. Thank you.
Great question. Maybe our provost would like to wrap up the session, the discussion points. Do you want to do that?
I think
he did a job for you, right? Okay. Please thank our panel again for the wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
May I now invite the provost to present a token of appreciation to our esteemed guests. Of course, our speaker, Professor George Day. Followed by Mr. Neil Croft from Mastercard Labs, and soon to be DBS. Professor Jack Disher from Emory University. Mr. Ambrish Jain from Lenovo. And last but not least, Mr. Sumit Basin from P&G.